She was born into a life of privilege amidst terror. Her father was distant, and one by one, those closest to her vanished.
This is the story of a daughter who carried the weight of a tyrant's name, but refused to carry his lies.
We all live in the shadow of our parents. Svetlana Alliluyeva, the daughter of Russian dictator Joseph Stalin, knew this better than most.
Svetlana Alliluyeva was the only daughter of Joseph Stalin, the man behind purges, gulags, and untold suffering. But to her, he was once just Papa. Before she died, she exposed a side of him the world never expected.
Father, it was pretty rough childhood.
Not the monster of history books, but a broken man consumed by fear, delusion, and control. Her truth unraveled decades of myth and silence, and it didn't come with vengeance, just pain. This isn't about Stalin, the ruler. It's about Stalin, the father. Let's dive in. The Little Sparrow Behind the Iron Curtain. Svetlana Alliluyeva was born in 1926 into the heart of the Soviet Empire, yet she lived her early years in a strange illusion. To the world, Joseph Stalin was a ruthless dictator, but to her, he was a kind, affectionate father who called her Little Sparrow. He would read to her, play games, and tuck her in at night. In the safety of their Kremlin residence, she had no reason to fear the man who ruled with terror. The walls of power cushioned her from the purges, the prisons, and the propaganda machine her father had built. But even in childhood, shadows crept in. When Svetlana was only 6, her mother, Nadezhda, died of a gunshot wound. The official explanation was suicide, but the details were murky. No one spoke of it openly. Stalin grew more distant, colder, and Svetlana, once his bright little girl, was left with questions no one dared answer. As she grew older, the disconnect between her father's public brutality and private tenderness became impossible to ignore. Friends of the family began disappearing. Conversations stopped mid-sentence if Stalin entered the room. Fear wasn't something she read about, it was something she breathed. And yet, she still clung to the version of her father she had known, the one who told her stories, the one who brushed her hair. It was this contradiction that would define her for life. Stalin loved her in his way, but that love came with conditions and consequences. When she fell in love with men he disapproved of, he intervened with chilling ruthlessness. Some were exiled, others vanished. The older she got, the clearer it became. She was not the daughter of a man. She was the daughter of a myth, and that myth was starting to crack. Cracks in the myth. By the time Svetlana reached adulthood, the warmth of her childhood had long since cooled. Her father's affection had turned possessive, almost strategic. Every part of her life, who she loved, where she lived, what she believed, had to align with his expectations. To defy him wasn't just disobedience, it was a political statement. And in Stalin's world, politics were deadly serious. Her first love, Alexei Kapler, a Jewish filmmaker twice her age, was sentenced to a labor camp shortly after their relationship began. No explanation, no warning, just gone. Svetlana understood the message clearly. Her father controlled everything, even her heart. Later relationships fared no better. Anyone she chose without Stalin's approval faced exile, silence, or worse. Love, in her world, was a risk. But the most devastating betrayal came not from strangers, but from the man who had once kissed her goodnight. As she pieced together the truth about the purges and the gulags, as she saw friends' parents vanish and teachers disappear, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Her father wasn't just feared by the world. He was feared inside his own home. The illusion shattered completely after Stalin died in 1953. His inner circle, once invincible, scrambled for control. Files were opened, secrets spilled. Svetlana saw the full extent of his tyranny. The show trials, the executions, the betrayals he ordered without hesitation. The man she had loved had overseen the deaths of millions. But even then, her feelings were complicated. She didn't hate him. She felt grief, confusion, and a strange sense of duty. She had loved a father who had never really existed. The public image and the private man were two different people, and both had shaped her. It was then she realized, to reclaim her life, she'd have to leave everything behind. The Great Escape. In 1967, Svetlana Alliluyeva made a decision that shocked the world. She defected from the Soviet Union. While on a diplomatic trip to India to scatter the ashes of her late husband, she walked into the U.S. Embassy and asked for political asylum. It wasn't just a bold move. It was unprecedented. The only daughter of Joseph Stalin, the very symbol of Soviet power, was abandoning her homeland and everything it represented. To the Kremlin, it was betrayal. To the West, it was a propaganda victory. But to Svetlana, it was something far more personal. It was a final act of rebellion against the man who had controlled her from the cradle. She didn't leave because she wanted attention. She left because she wanted to breathe. Arriving in the United States, Svetlana found herself thrust into a strange spotlight. Reporters followed her, governments watched her, and historians begged for her memoirs. Everyone wanted the inside story on Stalin, but she wasn't interested in fueling myths. She was trying to reclaim her identity, not as the dictator's daughter, but as a woman who had lived under his shadow for too long. She published her first memoir, 20 Letters to a Friend, shortly after arriving in the U.S. It wasn't a political takedown. It was intimate, reflective, and deeply human. She wrote of love and loss, of confusion and betrayal. She wrote about a father she once adored and eventually feared. Though she found moments of peace in the West, freedom came with a price. She moved frequently, struggled financially, and was haunted by loneliness. She missed her children left behind in Russia. She was a woman without a country, carrying a name the world would never let her forget. But despite it all, Svetlana had finally done the one thing her father never allowed. She chose her path. The last truth. In her final years, Svetlana Alliluyeva lived quietly, far from the political stage she had once been thrust upon. Gone were the flashbulbs, the interviews, the curious crowds. She had become, by choice, nearly invisible. But before she died in 2011, Svetlana made sure to tell the world one last truth, one that shattered the carefully preserved image of her father not only as a political giant, but as a man. She described Joseph Stalin not with hatred, but with clarity. He was not a genius, not a monster, not even a mystery. He was, in her words, a broken man, paranoid, lonely, deeply insecure. He craved control because he feared weakness. He punished betrayal, real or imagined, because he trusted no one. Even those closest to him, including his daughter, were kept at arm's length, manipulated, monitored, controlled. Svetlana's final reflections weren't just about Stalin. They were about the danger of myth. She believed the world had been too eager to paint her father as a symbol of fear, of strength, of evil. But in doing so, they had missed the truth. Stalin was not a symbol. He was a man who lost himself in power. He began as an idealist and ended as a tyrant trapped by his machinery of terror. She didn't excuse him. She exposed him. Her last words about him weren't grand or vengeful. They were tired. He was a prisoner of his lies, she said. He couldn't love. He couldn't trust. And in the end, he died surrounded by yes men and silence. What Svetlana left behind was not just a memoir or a political statement. It was a daughter's quiet reckoning, a final effort to reclaim her father from the shadows of propaganda and place him where he belonged, among the human, the flawed, and the deeply tragic. A life lived in exile. After her defection, Svetlana Alliluyeva spent the rest of her life wandering, not just across countries, but through identities. She changed her name several times, married multiple times, and moved from city to city, never quite settling, never quite escaping. Despite her desire for normalcy, the world never let her forget who she was. Stalin's daughter. It clung to her like a second skin, one she could never fully shed. She lived in the United States, India, the United Kingdom, and even briefly returned to the Soviet Union in the 1980s, hoping to reconnect with her past. But the past didn't welcome her back. Her children had grown into strangers. The Russia she remembered was gone. And so, once again, she fled, this time for good. In her later years, Svetlana lived in relative poverty in small towns across the American Midwest. There were no bodyguards, no government escorts, no headlines. She would take buses, shop for groceries alone, and sometimes sit silently in libraries for hours. Most people had no idea who she was, and perhaps, for the first time, she preferred it that way. But even in exile, the ghosts followed her. The weight of her father's crimes, her family's legacy, and the loss of those she loved never left her. She often spoke of her daughter, Olga, and the pain of their separation. She kept photographs, old letters, memories that refused to fade. Svetlana never found a true home. She was too Russian for the West, too Western for Russia, too Stalin for the world, and too human to belong to any ideology. Her life was marked not by politics, but by the quiet, relentless search for peace. And in the end, the only thing she truly owned was her story, and she made sure the world would hear it.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
The legacy of the little sparrow. Svetlana Alliluyeva didn't change history, but she forced us to look at it differently. Her life didn't unfold in the halls of power, but in the long, quiet corridors of memory, trauma, and truth. She never gave fiery speeches or led revolutions. Instead, her rebellion was personal. She walked away. From her country, from her name, from the myth of her father. That choice alone made her dangerous in the eyes of those who wanted to preserve the illusion. What Svetlana left behind was more than a story of survival. It was a challenge to blind loyalty, to inherited power, and to the way we remember those who rule through fear. Her message was clear. Tyranny is not always a monster roaring in public. Sometimes, it's a father tucking in his daughter while signing death warrants by candlelight. She showed us that even within dictatorships, there are cracks where humanity tries to survive. She was a witness to two versions of Stalin, the affectionate father and the calculating killer. And she spent her life trying to reconcile those two truths, even when they threatened to tear her apart. Svetlana's legacy isn't built on grand achievements or historical milestones. It lives in the uncomfortable truths she forced into the light. She reminded us that power distorts love, that silence is never neutral, that sometimes surviving history is a greater burden than making it. When she died in 2011 in a small Wisconsin town, there were no parades, no tributes, just a quiet end to a loud legacy. But Svetlana Alliluyeva didn't die in exile. She died on her terms, in a place of her choosing, far from the shadows of the Kremlin. And that, perhaps, was her final victory, not as Stalin's daughter, but as her own woman. The final word. Before her death, Svetlana Alliluyeva offered something no historian, defector, or survivor ever could: a daughter's truth. Not a political exposé or a bitter takedown, but a final, deeply personal account of the man the world called Stalin, and she called Papa. Her truth didn't come from headlines or secret files. It came from memory, from long silences, and from the ache of betrayal that only a child could feel. Svetlana didn't reduce her father to a monster, but she didn't defend him either. What she revealed was more unsettling. Stalin wasn't inhuman.
The authority which could not be, I loved him, I respected him, and when he was gone, I have lost.
He was a human who abandoned his humanity piece by piece. She described him in his later years as hollow, consumed by paranoia, increasingly isolated, a man obsessed with power but terrified of the people closest to him. He trusted no one. He couldn't show affection without control attached to it. To Svetlana, this was the real tragedy. Not just the crimes he committed, but the emptiness he became. She said he was a prisoner of his lies, a man who gave up every part of himself in exchange for power, and found that power could never love him back. In her final interviews, she spoke of him not with rage, but with sorrow. The man who once held her hand had, in the end, become a stranger behind cold eyes and locked doors, and yet she refused to let his darkness define her. Her final act wasn't rebellion. It was released. She lived long enough to say the words no one else dared, and she did it not to punish him, but to free herself. The world expected Stalin's daughter to stay silent, but instead, she told the truth. The raw, human, painful truth. And once it was spoken, it could never be silenced again. What remains? Svetlana Alliluyeva's story doesn't end with exile, heartbreak, or even death. It ends with the question she left behind. How do you live with a name that history wants to bury, and yet never forget? She never built a movement, never tried to clear her name, and never pretended to be a hero. But by choosing to tell her story, uncensored, unfiltered, and painfully human, she gave us something far more valuable: perspective. She showed that evil isn't always loud, and that those closest to it can be both victims and witnesses. She was neither saint nor traitor, but a survivor of an empire that tried to define her before she could define herself. What remains of Svetlana is not power or wealth, but a legacy built on painful truth. Letters, memories, interviews, fragments of a life caught between two worlds. Her daughter once said, Svetlana had a soul too big for any country. Maybe that's why she never stopped moving. She was always searching, not for safety, but for meaning. In telling us what Stalin was really like, not just as a leader, but as a man, Svetlana did something extraordinary. She made history personal. She reminded us that even the darkest chapters are written not just by leaders, but by those who live in their shadows. And that sometimes the quietest voice, the one that took decades to speak, is the one history needs most. Her truth didn't shout, it whispered, but it never lied. Her story, not his. For most of her life, Svetlana Alliluyeva was defined by someone else's story. Every introduction began with the same haunting phrase, Stalin's daughter. It was a title she never asked for, and one she could never escape. But in the end, she found a way to reclaim her narrative, not by erasing the past, but by refusing to be reduced by it. She didn't want to be remembered as an extension of a dictator. She wanted to be remembered as a woman who fought for her voice in a world determined to silence her. And that's what she became. Not an icon, not a politician, not a perfect figure, but a human being who carried unimaginable weight and still found the courage to speak. Her story isn't about Stalin. It's about survival after Stalin. It's about growing up inside the epicenter of terror and still learning how to love, how to trust, and how to live freely. It's about breaking generational silence, one truth at a time. When the world looked at her, they expected answers about the man, about the regime, about the crimes. But she gave them something more valuable: honesty, about how deeply those crimes reached into the walls of a home, into the heart of a child. Svetlana Alliluyeva was born in the darkest shadow of the 20th century, but she spent her life walking toward light, and by the time she died, she had done something Stalin never could. She told the truth. A name that couldn't break her. In the end, Svetlana Alliluyeva proved that even the heaviest name in history couldn't define a soul unwilling to be broken. She carried the burden of being Stalin's daughter not with pride, but with unshakable honesty. She could have chosen silence, anonymity, even denial, but she chose truth. Not the loud kind that demands attention, but the quiet kind that refuses to die. She lived through betrayal, exile, failed marriages, estranged children, and the suffocating legacy of a man whose shadow darkened entire nations. And yet, she never turned bitter. Her sorrow was deep, but never cruel. Her pain was personal, but never selfish. She spent her life trying to untangle love from power, memory from myth, and herself from a name that had stolen so much. Even as the world tried to make her a symbol of Cold War politics, of inherited guilt, of Soviet tragedy, Svetlana remained defiantly human. She didn't seek revenge. She sought understanding. And in the quiet corners of her life, in letters, in conversations, in her own daughter's memories, she left behind a legacy that had nothing to do with her father. She left us the reminder that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes it comes from a woman sitting alone at a kitchen table, remembering the past not with hatred, but with clarity. Svetlana didn't rewrite her family's history. She simply refused to let it be the only story told. And for that, her voice still echoes, soft, steady, and free. This was never just a story about Stalin. It was about the woman who refused to be swallowed by his legacy. Svetlana Alliluyeva didn't run from the truth. She lived inside it, carried its weight, and still managed to find her voice. She exposed the man behind the myth not with rage, but with quiet, devastating honesty. Her life reminds us that surviving history is sometimes harder than making it, and that even the daughter of a dictator can become something more: a witness, a survivor, a truth-teller. Her legacy is her own. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.